Margaret Sullivan stared at the pregnancy test in her trembling hands, watching the second pink line appear like a ghost from her past. 3 months pregnant. But that was impossible. She hadn't been with anyone since arriving in Millfield, Colorado 6 weeks ago to marry a man she'd only known through letters. The baby she carried belonged to a world she'd left behind, to a love story that had ended in heartbreak and shame. Now, standing in the small bathroom of her new husband's farmhouse, she faced an impossible choice: confess the truth to Thomas Henderson, the kind-hearted rancher who had offered her a new life, or live with a secret that could destroy everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The train whistle echoed across the Colorado plains as Margaret pressed, her face against the dusty window, watching endless fields of wheat bend in the summer wind. Her leather satchel sat heavy on her lap, containing everything she owned in the world: 2 dresses, a worn Bible, her mother's silver locket, and most importantly, the stack of letters tied with blue ribbon that had brought her here. Letters from Thomas Henderson, a widowed rancher seeking companionship and a mother for his young daughter. Margaret's hand instinctively moved to her still flat stomach. She'd discovered the pregnancy just 3 days before boarding the train in Boston, 3 days before leaving behind the scandal that had ruined her reputation and made her an outcast in her own family. Her sister Catherine had made it clear there was no place for an unwed mother in their respectable household, especially when the father was already married to someone else. "Next stop, Millfield," the conductor called out. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd written to Thomas about many things: her love of reading, her skill with cooking and sewing, her desire for a quiet life away from the city. But she hadn't mentioned the secret growing inside her, the consequence of a love affair with Professor William Morrison, her former employer who had promised to leave his wife but never did. The train lurched to a stop, and Margaret gathered her courage along with her belongings. She stepped onto the wooden platform, dust swirling around her dark blue traveling dress. The Colorado sun was fiercer than she'd expected, and she squinted as she searched the small crowd for the man who would be her husband. "Mrs. Sullivan?" Margaret turned to find a tall man with kind brown eyes and weather-worn hands removing his hat. His hair was the color of autumn wheat, and deep lines around his eyes spoke of years spent working under the open sky. He was older than she'd imagined, perhaps 40 to her 23, but his smile was genuine and warm. "Mr. Henderson." She managed a curtsy despite her nervousness. "Please call me Thomas. I hope the journey wasn't too difficult." It was long, but not unpleasant. Margaret noticed how his eyes never left her face, as if trying to reconcile the woman before him with the letters they'd exchanged. Thomas lifted her trunk with ease. "My daughter Emma is eager to meet you. She's been asking about you every day since I told her you were coming." As they walked toward his wagon, Margaret felt a flutter of movement in her stomach, or perhaps it was just nerves. At 3 months, surely it was too early to feel the baby moving, but the reminder of her condition made her stumble slightly. Thomas caught her elbow. "Are you all right? The altitude here can take some getting used to." "I'm fine, just tired from the journey." The ride to the Henderson Ranch gave Margaret her first real look at her new home. Rolling hills stretched in every direction, dotted with cattle and bordered by distant mountains that looked like purple shadows against the sky. The air smelled of sage and hay, so different from the smoke and crowds of Boston. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. "It can be lonely too," Thomas admitted, "especially for a woman used to city life. The nearest neighbor is 5 miles away, and town is a 2-hour ride." Margaret thought of the cramped boarding house where she'd lived in Boston, sharing a room with 2 other women and listening to the constant noise of the street. "I think I'll like the quiet." The Henderson farmhouse came into view as they crested a small hill. It was larger than Margaret had expected, a two-story structure with a wraparound porch and flower boxes under the windows. Behind it stood a red barn, a chicken coop, and several other outbuildings. Everything looked well-maintained and prosperous. A small figure burst from the front door as they approached. "Papa! Papa! Is that her?" Thomas chuckled. "Emma, what have I told you about running in your good dress?" The girl who approached was perhaps 8 years old, with her father's brown eyes and hair the color of honey. Her face was flushed with excitement, and she practically bounced on her toes as she waited for an introduction. "Emma, this is Margaret Sullivan. Margaret, my daughter Emma." "How do you do, Emma?" Margaret offered her hand, which the child shook with surprising formality. "Are you really going to marry Papa? Are you going to be my new mama? Can you make apple pie? Mrs. Murphy down the road makes terrible apple pie, but Papa says I shouldn't say so because it's not polite." "Emma," Thomas warned gently. Margaret laughed despite her nervousness. "I can make apple pie, though I can't promise it will be very good at first. I'll need to learn about your kitchen and what ingredients are available here." Emma beamed. "I can help. I know where Papa keeps everything, and I can show you the root cellar and the smokehouse and the spring house where we keep the milk cool." As Thomas carried her trunk inside, Margaret looked around the house that would be her new home. The parlor was simply furnished but comfortable, with a stone fireplace and shelves lined with books. Through an archway, she could see the kitchen with its large wooden table and cast-iron stove. "I've prepared the spare room for you," Thomas said, setting down her trunk. I thought you might want some time to settle in before we discuss the arrangements." Margaret felt a rush of gratitude for his consideration. Many mail-order marriages were expected to be consummated immediately, but Thomas seemed to understand that they were still strangers. "Thank you. That's very thoughtful." Emma tugged at Margaret's skirt. "Want to see my room? And I can show you Mama's garden. Papa hasn't been very good at keeping it, but maybe you can make it pretty again." Margaret's heart clenched at the mention of Thomas's first wife. "I'd like that very much." The next few days passed in a blur of introductions and adjustments. Margaret met the ranch hands, Jake Morrison and his teenage son Billy, along with old Pete, who had worked for the Hendersons for 20 years. She learned the routines of farm life, from milking the cows at dawn to collecting eggs and tending the vegetable garden Emma's mother had planted. Thomas was patient with her inexperience, showing her how to work the hand pump at the kitchen sink and explaining the intricacies of the wood-burning stove. Emma became her shadow, chattering constantly about everything from her favorite hiding spots to her memories of her mother, who had died of pneumonia 2 winters ago. "Mama used to sing while she cooked," Emma confided as they prepared dinner. On Margaret's 3rd day. "Do you sing?" Margaret's throat tightened. She'd sung often in Boston, humming while she worked as Professor Morrison's housekeeper and tutor to his children. But those songs belonged to another life. "Sometimes," she admitted, "will you teach me the songs you know, perhaps?" At night, alone in her small room, Margaret would place her hands on her stomach and whisper to the child growing there. She'd calculated the dates carefully. The baby would be born in January, right in the middle of Colorado's harsh winter. By then, she'd either have to confess the truth to Thomas or find a way to convince him the child was premature. The thought of lying to this good man made her stomach turn, but the alternative seemed impossible. Thomas had been nothing but kind to her, and Emma was beginning to warm to the idea of having a mother again. How could she destroy their happiness with the truth about her shameful past? On her 4th morning at the ranch, Margaret woke to the sound of Emma crying. She quickly dressed and found the child in the kitchen, tears streaming down her face as she tried to start the fire in the stove. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" "Papa's sick," Emma sobbed. "He's got a fever and he can't get out of bed, and I don't know how to make breakfast, and the men will be hungry, and—" Margaret gathered the frightened child into her arms. "Shh! It's all right. I'll take care of everything. She sent Billy to fetch Dr. Harrison from town while she tended to Thomas, who was indeed burning with fever and delirious. She'd dealt with illness before during her time working for families in Boston, and she recognized the signs of influenza. For the next week, Margaret barely left Thomas's side. She bathed his fevered brow with cool cloths, forced broth between his lips when he was lucid enough to swallow, and sat up nights listening to his labored breathing. Emma helped as much as a child could, and the ranch hands took care of the outdoor work, but the house and Thomas's care fell entirely to Margaret. It was during one of those long nights, as she dozed in the chair beside his bed, that Thomas began to talk in his delirium. Most of it was nonsensical, fever dreams about cattle and weather, but sometimes he spoke of his first wife, Sarah. Sarah, the baby. We lost the baby. I'm so sorry, Sarah. Wanted to give you children. My fault. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Margaret's heart ached for the pain in his voice. She'd wondered why Thomas and Sarah had only had Emma, but now she understood. They'd tried for more children and failed, a common heartbreak that she knew destroyed many marriages. When Thomas's fever finally broke on the 7th day, the first thing he saw was Margaret's face, pale with exhaustion, but smiling with relief. You stayed, he whispered, his voice hoarse. Where else would I go? He reached for her hand with fingers that trembled from weakness. Thank you. I don't know what I would have done. You don't need to thank me. This is what people do for each other. Thomas squeezed her hand gently. Sarah would have liked you. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. I hope so. As Thomas recovered his strength over the following days, something shifted between them. The formal politeness of their initial meeting gave way to genuine warmth and companionship. Thomas would watch Margaret as she worked, and she would catch him smiling at her attempts to master the intricacies of farm cooking. Emma, delighted to have her father well again, declared that Margaret was definitely going to be the best stepmother ever. It was Emma who brought up the subject of the wedding during dinner one evening in late August. When are you and Papa going to get married? She asked around a mouthful of cornbread. Mrs. Murphy says people are starting to talk about you living here without being properly wed. Thomas flushed. Emma, that's not an appropriate dinner conversation. But it's true, isn't it? You said you were going to marry Margaret, and she's been here almost a month. Margaret set down her fork, her appetite suddenly gone. She'd been dreading this conversation, knowing it would have to come, but hoping to delay it as long as possible. At 3.5 months pregnant, her dresses were starting to feel tight around the waist, though she'd managed to hide it so far with careful corseting and loose aprons. Emma's right, Thomas said quietly. People are talking, and it's not fair to your reputation, Margaret. If you're having second thoughts— No, Margaret said quickly. No second thoughts. I want to be sure we're doing this for the right reasons. Thomas studied her face across the candle-lit table. What would be the right reasons? Margaret's heart hammered. This was her chance to tell him the truth, to confess everything, and let him decide if he could accept her and the child she carried. But looking at Emma's eager face and remembering Thomas's fevered words about the babies he and Sarah had lost, she couldn't bring herself to speak. Companionship, she said finally, mutual respect, care for each other and for Emma. Those seem like good reasons to me. Emma clapped her hands. So we can have the wedding. Can I wear my Sunday dress? Can we have a party? Thomas laughed. We'll see about the party. But yes, I think it's time we made this official. They set the date for the first Saturday in September, giving them just over a week to prepare. The ceremony would be simple, held in the small church in Millfield. With Pastor Williams officiating, Margaret wrote a letter to her sister Catherine, informing her of the wedding but not expecting a reply. As the day approached, Margaret's morning sickness returned with a vengeance. She attributed it to wedding nerves when Emma asked why she looked so pale, and she was grateful that Thomas was too busy with ranch work to notice her frequent trips to the outhouse. The night before the wedding, as Margaret sat brushing her hair by lamplight, she made a decision. She would marry Thomas Henderson and try to be the wife he deserved. When the baby came, she would tell him it was premature and hope that his joy at finally having another child would overcome any questions about the timing. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't entirely a lie either. And maybe, just maybe, love could grow from the seeds of companionship and respect they'd already planted. Margaret placed her hands on her stomach, where the first small curve of pregnancy was becoming visible. "I'm going to give you a good life," she whispered to her unborn child, "a father who will love you and a sister who's already excited to meet you. That has to be enough." Outside her window, the Colorado wind whispered through the wheat fields, carrying the promise of autumn and the uncertainties that lay ahead. The morning of her wedding dawned crisp and clear, with golden sunlight streaming across the wheat fields like God's own blessing. Margaret stood before the cracked mirror in her room, adjusting the collar of her best dress, a deep green wool that brought out her eyes, and more importantly, concealed the growing changes in her figure. At 4 months pregnant, she could no longer deny the reality of her condition, though she'd managed to hide it from Thomas and Emma through careful positioning and strategic use of shawls. Emma burst through the door without knocking, her face glowing with excitement. "Margaret, Papa says it's time to go. Oh, you look so pretty. Are you nervous?" "I'm nervous, and I'm not even getting married." Margaret smoothed her hands over her skirt one final time. "A little nervous, yes, but good nervous. Mama used to say that butterflies in your stomach meant something important was happening." Emma's expression grew momentarily serious. "I think she would be happy about today. Papa smiles more when you're around." The simple words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Here was this innocent child, welcoming her with open arms, never suspecting that Margaret was bringing deception into their home. The weight of her secret felt heavier than ever as she followed Emma downstairs. Thomas waited by the front door, dressed in his finest suit, a black wool jacket that emphasized his broad shoulders and made his brown eyes appear even warmer. He'd obviously made an effort with his appearance, his hair neatly combed and his boots polished to a shine. "You look beautiful," he said simply, offering her his arm. The ride to town passed in comfortable silence, broken only by Emma's chatter about the small reception the church ladies had insisted on preparing. Margaret tried to focus on the rolling landscape and the warmth of Thomas's presence beside her, but her mind kept drifting to the child growing within her. What would Thomas say when the baby arrived months earlier than expected? Would he believe her story about a premature birth, or would he see through her deception? Millfield's church was a modest white building with a simple steeple, surrounded by cottonwood trees that provided blessed shade from the September sun. A small crowd had gathered, more people than Margaret had expected, given that she was a stranger to most of them. But Thomas was well respected in the community, and curiosity about his mail-order bride had drawn neighbors from miles around. Pastor Williams, a kindly man with silver hair and gentle eyes, greeted them at the door. "Thomas, Margaret, what a joyous day. The Lord smiles on unions built on faith and commitment." Inside the church, Margaret was surprised to see familiar faces. Jake Morrison and his son Billy sat in the front pew, along with old Pete and several other ranch hands. Dr. Harrison, who had tended to Thomas during his illness, nodded respectfully as they passed. Even Mrs. Murphy, the neighbor Emma had mentioned, offered a genuine smile despite her reputation for gossip. As they took their places at the altar, Margaret caught sight of a man she didn't recognize, sitting alone in the back pew. He was well-dressed, with dark hair and an expensive-looking coat that seemed out of place in the simple country church. Something about his intent stare made her uncomfortable, but before she could think about it further, Pastor Williams began the ceremony. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of God to join Thomas Henderson and Margaret Sullivan in holy matrimony. The familiar words washed over Margaret like a tide. She found herself studying Thomas's profile as he listened attentively to the pastor's words about love, honor, and fidelity. His jaw was strong, his expression serious, but not stern. When he turned to look at her during the exchange of vows, she saw nothing but sincerity in his eyes. Do you, Thomas Henderson, take Margaret Sullivan to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live? I do. Thomas's voice was steady, and, You sure? Do you, Margaret Sullivan, take Thomas Henderson to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live? Margaret's throat felt tight. The words seemed to stick, weighed down by the magnitude of the promise she was making, while concealing such a significant truth. But Thomas was looking at her with such trust, such hope, that she managed to whisper, I do. When Thomas slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, Margaret felt a strange mix of joy and guilt. The ring had belonged to his first wife, Sarah. He told her so when he offered it, explaining that Sarah would have wanted it to continue symbolizing love and commitment in their home. Margaret had been touched by the gesture, but now the weight of the gold seemed to burn against her skin. You may kiss the bride. Thomas's lips were gentle against hers, the kiss chaste and respectful in front of the congregation. But Margaret could feel the promise of deeper affection in the tender way his hand cupped her cheek, and her heart ached with the knowledge that their marriage was beginning with deception. The reception in the church basement was a warm, welcoming affair. The ladies of the congregation had prepared a feast of fried chicken, fresh bread, green beans from their gardens, and 3 different kinds of pie. Emma appointed herself the official hostess, introducing Margaret to everyone and proudly announcing that she now had a mother again. Margaret tried to enjoy the celebration, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Several times she caught glimpses of the dark-haired stranger from the back pew, though he seemed to disappear whenever she tried to get a better look at him. Are you feeling all right? Thomas appeared at her elbow with a plate of food. You look a bit pale. Just overwhelmed, Margaret managed. So many new faces to remember. Thomas guided her to a quiet corner where they could sit together. I know it's a lot. These people can be overwhelming when they're trying to be welcoming, but they mean well, and they're genuinely happy for us. Margaret picked at her food, her appetite diminished by both pregnancy nausea and nervous tension. Tell me about some of them. I want to know who our neighbors are. Thomas pointed out various members of the community, the Johnsons, who ran the general store, the Parkers, who had the farm to the east, the widow Carson, who taught school and had offered to help Emma with her letters. His descriptions were warm and detailed, revealing his deep connection to this place and these people. And what about the man in the expensive coat? Margaret tried to sound casual. The one who was sitting alone in the back? Thomas followed her gaze, but the stranger was nowhere to be seen. I'm not sure who you mean. Can you describe him? Dark hair, well-dressed. He seemed to be watching me during the ceremony. A slight frown creased Thomas's brow. That's odd. I thought I knew everyone who would come today. Maybe he was just passing through town and stopped to witness the ceremony. Some folks do that, think it's good luck to see a wedding. Margaret nodded, but the explanation didn't ease her discomfort. Something about the man's intense stare had felt personal, almost familiar, though she was certain she'd never seen him before. The afternoon passed pleasantly enough, with music and dancing in the churchyard as the sun began to sink toward the western mountains. Emma danced with anyone who would ask her face flushed with joy and excitement. Margaret found herself genuinely touched by the warmth of her reception into the community, even as guilt continued to gnaw at her conscience. As evening approached, they began the journey home as a family. Emma fell asleep in the back of the wagon, exhausted by the day's excitement, leaving Margaret and Thomas alone with their thoughts as the horses picked their way along the familiar road. "Are you happy?" Thomas asked quietly, his eyes on the road ahead. Margaret considered the question carefully. Despite everything, the secret she carried, the deception that tainted her vows, she found that she was in a way happy. The fear and uncertainty she'd lived with in Boston felt distant now, replaced by the warmth of belonging somewhere, of being needed and wanted. "Yes," she said simply. "I think I am." Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "Good. I want you to be happy here, Margaret. I want this to be a real home for you, not just a place you ended up." Back at the ranch, they carried a still sleeping Emma to her bed before standing awkwardly in the parlor, suddenly faced with the reality of being husband and wife. Thomas cleared his throat, his earlier confidence seeming to desert him. "I want you to know," he said carefully, "that I don't expect, that is, I understand if you need more time to feel comfortable with all aspects of marriage." Margaret's cheeks burned, but she was grateful for his consideration. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here was this good man offering her time and patience, while she was already carrying another man's child. "Thank you," she managed. "I appreciate your understanding." Thomas nodded, relief evident in his expression. "Well then, I'll say good night. Tomorrow we can start settling into our new routine." As Margaret prepared for bed in what was now her permanent room, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. The wedding ring on her finger caught the lamplight, a golden circle that should have symbolized new beginnings, but instead felt like a weight of responsibility she wasn't sure she could bear. She placed her hands on her stomach, where the child was making its presence increasingly known. In a few more weeks, she wouldn't be able to hide her condition any longer. The thought of Thomas's reaction when he discovered the truth made her feel sick with dread. The next few weeks settled into a comfortable pattern. Margaret threw herself into the role of ranch wife, learning to cook on the massive wood stove, managing the household accounts, and helping with the endless tasks that came with rural life. Thomas was patient with her mistakes and generous with his praise when she succeeded, creating an atmosphere of mutual respect and growing affection. Emma blossomed under Margaret's attention, chattering constantly about her day, her dreams, her memories of her mother. Margaret found herself genuinely caring for the child, which made her deception feel even worse. Emma deserved honesty from the woman she was beginning to think of as her mother. It was during the third week of October that Margaret's careful secret-keeping began to unravel. She was in the kitchen preparing lunch when a wave of dizziness struck her with such force that she had to grip the edge of the table to keep from falling. The room spun around her, and she felt the familiar nausea rising in her throat. Emma, who had been setting the table, dropped her handful of forks with a clatter. "Margaret, are you sick? Should I get Papa?" No, I'm fine." Margaret forced herself to straighten up, though the room continued to tilt alarmingly. Just felt a bit faint for a moment. But Emma was already running toward the door, calling for her father with the panic of a child who had lost one mother and feared losing another. Within moments, Thomas was in the kitchen, his face creased with concern as he took in Margaret's pale face and trembling hands. "What happened?" "Nothing serious. I just felt dizzy for a moment. I probably stood up too quickly." Thomas wasn't satisfied with that explanation. He guided her to a chair and knelt beside her, his calloused hands gentle as he felt her forehead. For fever. You've been looking peaked for the past few days. Maybe we should have Dr. Harrison take a look at you. That's not necessary, Margaret said quickly. I'm perfectly fine. But even as she spoke, another wave of nausea hit her. She clapped her hand over her mouth and rushed outside, barely making it to the side of the house before she was violently sick. Thomas followed her, holding her hair back from her face as she retched into the dirt. When the spell passed, Margaret found herself leaning against Thomas's solid chest, his arms supporting her weight. For a moment she allowed herself to feel safe in his embrace, to imagine what it might be like if she could tell him the truth and find acceptance instead of condemnation. That's it, Thomas said firmly. I'm sending Billy for the doctor. Please don't, I'll be fine by tomorrow. Thomas pulled back to look at her, his brown eyes searching her face. Margaret, what aren't you telling me? You've been having these spells for over a week now, and you've barely been eating. If you're seriously ill... The concern in his voice nearly broke her resolve. Here was a man who genuinely cared about her well-being, who was prepared to move heaven and earth to make sure she was taken care of. The thought of disappointing him, of revealing herself as a fraud and a deceiver, was almost more than she could bear. I'm not ill, she whispered, the words torn from her throat. At least, not in the way you think. Thomas frowned. What do you mean? Margaret closed her eyes, gathering what remained of her courage. The moment of truth had arrived sooner than she'd hoped, but perhaps it was for the best. She couldn't continue living this lie, not when Thomas was being so kind to her, not when Emma was beginning to love her. Thomas, she began, her voice barely audible. There's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you before we married. The change in Thomas's expression was subtle, but unmistakable. The warmth in his eyes cooled slightly, replaced by wariness and a growing understanding that whatever she was about to reveal would change everything between them. Go on, he said quietly. Margaret took a shaky breath, knowing that the next words out of her mouth would either destroy her marriage or, by some miracle, strengthen it beyond anything she had dared to hope. I'm with child, Thomas. I've been carrying a baby since before I came to Colorado. The silence that followed Margaret's confession stretched like a chasm between them. Thomas's face went through a series of expressions: shock, confusion, hurt, and finally, a carefully controlled blankness that was somehow worse than anger would have been. He stepped back from her, his hands falling to his sides, and Margaret felt the physical distance like a knife to her heart. How long? His voice was barely above a whisper. Nearly 5 months now. Margaret wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly, cold, despite the October sun. The baby will come in January. Thomas turned away from her, his shoulders rigid with tension. He stared out across the wheat fields, his jaw working as he processed the magnitude of her deception. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and careful, as if he were afraid of what might come out if he lost control. 5 months. You were already carrying another man's child when you answered my advertisement, when you wrote those letters, when you stood in that church yesterday and promised to be my wife. Each word hit Margaret like a physical blow. Yes. Were you ever going to tell me? Or were you planning to pass the child off as mine when it came early? The accuracy of his guess made Margaret flinch. I don't know. I hoped. You hoped what? That I was fool enough to believe a 5-month baby was premature. Thomas's voice cracked slightly, revealing the pain beneath his controlled exterior. Or did you think I was desperate enough for a wife that I'd accept any deception you cared to practice on me? No, it wasn't like that. Thomas, please let me explain. Explain? He whirled to face her, and Margaret saw tears glittering in his eyes. What is there to explain, Margaret? You came here under false pretenses. You married me while carrying another man's child. You let Emma grow attached to you, let her call you mother, knowing that this secret could destroy everything. The mention of Emma sent a fresh wave of guilt crashing over Margaret. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. I was desperate, Thomas. I had nowhere else to go. So you came here, to my home. You let me care for you when I was sick, let me believe we were building something real together. Thomas's voice broke completely now. Dear God, Margaret, I thought we could have the kind of marriage Sarah and I never managed to achieve. I thought God had sent you to us. Margaret reached toward him instinctively. Thomas, don't. He stepped back again, his expression shuddering. I need to think. I can't look at you right now. He strode toward the barn, leaving Margaret standing alone by the side of the house. She sank down onto the porch steps, her legs no longer able to support her. The conversation had gone even worse than she'd feared. Thomas's pain was evident in every word, every gesture, and she knew she was responsible for putting it there. Emma appeared in the doorway, her young face creased with worry. Margaret, why was Papa shouting? Are you really sick? Margaret forced herself to smile, though she knew it was a poor imitation of reassurance. Your father and I just had a disagreement, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups need to talk through difficult things. But you're not going to leave, are you? Emma's voice was small and frightened. You're not going to go away like Mama did? The innocent question shattered what remained of Margaret's composure. She pulled Emma into her arms, holding the child close as tears streamed down her face. I don't know, Emma. That's not up to me anymore. Thomas didn't return to the house for dinner. Margaret and Emma ate in uncomfortable silence, both of them picking at their food while listening for the sound of his boots on the porch. When bedtime came and he still hadn't appeared, Emma's anxiety reached a breaking point. Where is Papa? Why won't he come inside? Margaret tucked the blankets around Emma's small form, her heart breaking at the fear in the child's eyes. He's just thinking about some important things. He'll be back. Are you going to get divorced? Tommy Peterson's parents got divorced and his mama moved to Denver, and he hardly ever sees her anymore. I don't know what's going to happen, Margaret admitted, unable to offer false comfort. But whatever happens, it won't be because anyone stopped caring about you. She sat with Emma until the child finally fell asleep, then went to her own room to wait. Through her window she could see the glow of a lantern in the barn. Thomas was still out there, probably trying to make sense of the bombshell she'd dropped on their fragile new marriage. Margaret placed her hands on her stomach, where the baby was becoming increasingly active. The child seemed to sense her distress, moving restlessly as if trying to comfort its mother. She'd known this moment would come eventually, but she'd hoped to have more time to prove herself worthy of Thomas's trust and affection before revealing the truth. Hours passed before she heard the front door open and close softly. Thomas's footsteps moved through the house with careful quietness, clearly trying not to wake Emma. Margaret held her breath, hoping he might stop at her door, might give her a chance to explain herself more fully. But his steps continued past her room to his own, and she heard his door close with gentle finality. The next morning brought an awkward dance of avoidance. Thomas was already gone when Margaret came downstairs, though he'd left coffee warming on the stove and a note indicating he'd be working the far pasture with the men. Emma charted nervously through breakfast, clearly sensing the tension, even if she didn't understand its source. Margaret threw herself into household tasks with desperate energy, scrubbing floors that were already clean and reorganizing pantry. Shelves that were perfectly organized. She was beating rugs on the back porch when Jake Morrison approached the house, his weathered face creased with concern. Begging your pardon, Mrs. Henderson, but is everything all right? Thomas has been working like a man possessed all morning, and he looks like he hasn't slept. Margaret's hand stilled on the rug beater. We had a disagreement yesterday. He's probably just working through his feelings. Jake nodded slowly. He's a good man, Thomas is. Fair and honest to a fault. But he's been hurt before, you know. When Sarah kept losing those babies, it nearly killed him each time. He blamed himself, thought he was cursed somehow. The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Thomas had mentioned losing children with Sarah, but she hadn't understood the full extent of their tragedy. No wonder her deception felt like such a betrayal. She'd brought the promise of new life into his home while concealing its true origins. "How many?" she whispered. "3 that I know of. Sarah would get with the child and they'd be so happy, planning and preparing. But then she'd lose it, usually around the 4th or 5th month. The last time nearly killed her. She bled for days, and Doc Harrison wasn't sure she'd pull through." Margaret's knees went weak. She sank down onto the porch steps, her mind reeling with this new understanding of Thomas's pain. He'd lost 3 children with his beloved wife, had watched her suffer through repeated miscarriages, and then Margaret had appeared carrying another man's child while keeping the truth hidden. "Mrs. Henderson, are you all right?" Margaret looked up to find Jake watching her with concern. "I'm fine, just felt dizzy for a moment." Jake's expression shifted, his eyes taking in her pale face and the way her hand had instinctively moved to her stomach. Understanding dawned in his weathered features, and Margaret realized her secret was no longer limited to Thomas. "Ah," Jake said quietly. "I see. Please don't say anything to the other men," Margaret whispered. "Thomas only just found out yesterday, and he's not taking it well." Jake removed his hat, running his fingers through his graying hair. "That explains his mood today. How far along are you?" 5 months, Jake whistled low under his breath. "And Thomas isn't the father." It wasn't a question, and Margaret saw no point in denying it. "No, the child belongs to someone from my past, someone who wouldn't take responsibility. Does Thomas know the whole story? He knows I was carrying another man's child when I married him. I don't think he wants to hear the details." Jake replaced his hat, his expression thoughtful. "Thomas is a good man, but he's got his pride. Finding out his new wife deceived him about something this important, well, it's going to take time for him to work through it." "Do you think he'll ever forgive me?" Jake studied her face for a long moment. "That depends on why you did it, I suppose, and whether you truly care for him now, or if he was just a convenient solution to your problem." The question pierced straight to the heart of Margaret's guilt. She'd come to Colorado seeking a practical arrangement, a way to escape the scandal that had ruined her life in Boston, but somewhere along the way, her feelings had deepened into something real and precious. The thought of losing Thomas now was almost unbearable. "I care for him," she said simply. "More than I expected to. More than I probably deserve to." Jake nodded slowly. "Then you'd better figure out how to show him that. Because right now, all he can see is the deception. He can't see past it to whatever real feelings might be growing between you." That evening, Thomas returned to the house for dinner, but the meal passed in strained silence. Emma tried several times to start conversations, but her attempts fell flat against the wall of tension between her father and stepmother. Finally, she threw down her fork in frustration. "Why won't anybody talk? Why is everyone acting so strange?" Thomas set down his coffee cup with careful precision. "Emma, Margaret and I need to have some adult conversations about our future. It doesn't concern you, and you shouldn't worry about it. But I am worried. You're both acting like someone died, and Margaret looks like she's been crying, and you won't even look at her." Margaret's heart clenched at the child's distress. "Emma, sweetheart, are you going to send Margaret away?" Emma's voice cracked with fear. "Is that what this is about? Because I don't want her to go. I like having a mama again." Thomas's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. "Emma, it's complicated. There are things you don't understand." "Then explain them to me. I'm not a baby. Margaret watched Thomas struggle with how much to tell his daughter. The truth was too complex and adult for Emma to fully comprehend, but the child deserved some explanation for the sudden change in their household dynamics. Margaret wasn't completely honest with me about some important things, Thomas said finally. When people aren't honest with each other, it makes it hard to trust them. Emma's eyes widened as she looked between her father and stepmother. What kind of things? The kind of things that adults need to work out between themselves, Thomas replied firmly. But I want you to know that whatever happens, it has nothing to do with you. You've done nothing wrong. Emma burst into tears, pushing back from the table and running from the room. Margaret started to follow her, but Thomas caught her arm. Let me, he said quietly. She's my daughter, my responsibility. The words stung, clearly intended to remind Margaret of her outsider status in this family. She nodded and began clearing the dinner dishes, listening to the murmur of voices from Emma's room as Thomas tried to comfort his daughter. Later that evening, as Margaret sat mending one of Emma's dresses by lamplight, Thomas appeared in the parlor doorway. He looked exhausted, his hair disheveled and his shirt wrinkled from the day's work. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. Margaret set aside her sewing and folded her hands in her lap, bracing herself for whatever he had decided during his day of solitary contemplation. Thomas took the chair across from her, maintaining the careful distance he'd established since her confession. "I've been thinking about our situation, and I see several possible solutions." The formal tone of his voice made Margaret's heart sink. This wasn't going to be a conversation about forgiveness and second chances. This was going to be a business discussion about the practical aspects of their failed marriage. "The first option is annulment," Thomas continued. "Given that you concealed such a significant fact before our marriage, I believe we could make a case for fraud. You could return to your family in Boston." "I have no family to return to," Margaret said quietly. "My sister made it clear that I'm not welcome in her home." Thomas's expression flickered with something that might have been sympathy, but he pressed on. "The second option is divorce, though that would create scandal for both of us. You'd need to find somewhere else to live, obviously. And the third option—" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on his hands. "We could continue as we are, married in name, sharing a household for practical purposes, but there would be conditions." Margaret waited, hardly daring to breathe. "You would need to tell Emma the truth about the baby when it becomes obvious. I won't have her confused about where children come from, or believing lies about her new sibling. And you would need to understand that this would be a marriage of convenience only. I can't trust you the way a husband should trust his wife." The pain in his voice was evident, and Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "Thomas, if you'd let me explain how this happened—" "I don't want to hear about him," Thomas said, sharply. "I don't want to know who he was, or what he meant to you. That's your past, and I want no part of it." Margaret nodded, understanding that this was as much as she could hope for. Thomas was offering her a roof over her head and legitimacy for her child, even if he couldn't offer forgiveness or love. "Which option do you prefer?" she asked. Thomas was quiet for so long that Margaret began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Emma loves you. In just 2 months, you've become the mother she's been missing. I can't take that away from her, no matter how I feel about your deception. So we stay married." "We stay married," he confirmed. "But Margaret, I need you to understand that things between us have changed. I can't just pretend this didn't happen and go back to the way we were." Margaret nodded, blinking back tears. "I understand." Thomas stood to leave, then paused at the doorway. "There's one more thing. When the child comes, it will bear my name and be raised as my own. Whatever mistakes you made in the past, the baby is innocent. I won't have a child in my household treated as anything less than family." The unexpected generosity of the gesture broke Margaret's careful composure. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "Thank you." Thomas's expression softened slightly at her tears, but he didn't move to comfort her. "Get some rest, Margaret. Tomorrow we'll start figuring out how to make this work." As his footsteps faded down the hallway, Margaret placed her hands on her stomach and whispered to the child within, "You're going to have a good father, little one. A man who'll love you. Even though you're not his blood, that's more than either of us had any right to hope for." Outside, the Colorado wind howled across the plains, carrying the promise of winter and the uncertain future that lay ahead for them all. The weeks following Margaret's confession settled into a routine of careful politeness and unspoken boundaries. Thomas spoke to her only when necessary, his words measured and distant. He slept in the barn most nights, claiming he needed to tend to a sick horse or check on the cattle, but Margaret knew he simply couldn't bear to be in the same house with her. Emma, sensing the change but not understanding it, became increasingly clingy with Margaret, while shooting worried glances at her father's withdrawn demeanor. November brought the first real snow to the Colorado plains, blanketing the ranch in pristine white that made the landscape look deceptively peaceful. Margaret's pregnancy was becoming impossible to hide now, her figure rounding noticeably, despite her efforts to conceal it with loose clothing and strategically placed aprons. She caught Thomas looking at her belly once, his expression unreadable, before he quickly averted his gaze and left the room. It was on a particularly bitter morning, as Margaret struggled to carry water from the well with her changing center of balance, that disaster struck. Her foot hit a patch of ice hidden beneath the snow, and she went down hard, the heavy bucket flying from her hands as she instinctively tried to protect her stomach. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs, and for a terrifying moment she lay in the snow, gasping and afraid to move. "Margaret!" Thomas's voice cut through the morning air like a whip crack. She hadn't even known he was nearby, but suddenly he was there, kneeling beside her in the snow, his hands hovering over her as if he wanted to help but wasn't sure he should touch her. "The baby," she gasped, her hands pressed protectively over her belly. "I fell on my side, but I'm afraid. Can you move? Are you hurt anywhere else?" Thomas's professional demeanor had replaced his emotional distance, and Margaret was grateful for his steady presence, even if it came from a sense of duty rather than affection. With his help, she managed to sit up, testing her limbs for injury. Her hip throbbed where she'd landed, and her hands were scraped from trying to break her fall, but nothing seemed seriously damaged. Most importantly, the baby was moving normally, its familiar fluttering providing reassurance that all was well. "I think we're both all right," she said, accepting Thomas's hand as he helped her to her feet. "Just shaken up." Thomas's jaw was tight with worry and something that looked suspiciously like anger. "What were you thinking, carrying water in your condition? You could have been seriously hurt. The baby could have—" He stopped abruptly, as if remembering that his concern for her child was complicated by its parentage. "I've been carrying water for weeks," Margaret said defensively. "I didn't think—" "That's the problem. You didn't think." Thomas guided her toward the house with a firm hand on her elbow. "From now on, Emma or I will handle the heavy lifting. You're not to attempt anything that could put you or the child at risk." Despite his harsh tone, Margaret felt a flicker of hope at his protectiveness. Even angry with her, even hurt by her deception, Thomas was still concerned for her welfare, and that of the baby she carried. Inside the warm kitchen, Thomas insisted on examining her scrapes while Emma hovered anxiously nearby. His touch was gentle but impersonal as he cleaned the cuts on her palms, and Margaret found herself remembering the tenderness he'd shown during their brief courtship, before everything had changed. "What happened?" Emma demanded. "Why were you on the ground? Is the baby hurt?" Margaret froze at Emma's words, her eyes flying to Thomas's face. They hadn't yet had the conversation about telling Emma the truth, and Margaret wasn't sure how much the child had guessed about her condition. Thomas's expression remained carefully neutral. Margaret fell on the ice. She's fine, and so is the baby. What baby? Emma's eyes widened as understanding began to dawn. Margaret, are you having a baby? Are we going to have a new baby in our family? Margaret looked helplessly at Thomas, unsure how to navigate this moment without his guidance. He met her gaze for a long moment, then turned to his daughter with the same careful composure he'd shown Margaret. Yes, Emma. Margaret is expecting a child. The baby will be born sometime after Christmas. Emma's face lit up with pure joy. Really? We're going to have a baby. I'm going to be a big sister. She turned to Margaret with excitement radiating from every feature. Is it a boy or a girl? Can I help take care of it? Can I teach it things? The innocent happiness in Emma's reaction was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. Here was a child who had lost her mother and desperately wanted to be part of a complete family again, not knowing that the baby represented the fracture lines in her parents' marriage rather than its strengthening. We won't know if it's a boy or girl until it's born, Margaret managed. And yes, you can certainly help take care of your new brother or sister. This is the best news ever. Emma threw her arms around Margaret's waist, careful to avoid her injured hands. I've always wanted a baby brother or sister. Mama and Papa tried, but it never worked out. But now we're going to have one. Over Emma's head, Margaret saw Thomas's face go pale at his daughter's innocent reference to their past losses. The pain that flickered across his features made Margaret's heart ache with fresh guilt for the timing of her revelation and the way it must echo those earlier disappointments. Thomas excused himself abruptly, mumbling something about checking on the livestock. Emma was too excited to notice her father's reaction, chattering non-stop about all the things she wanted to teach the new baby and asking endless questions about when it would arrive and where it would sleep. That evening, after Emma had finally exhausted herself with excitement and gone to bed, Margaret found Thomas in the barn, as she'd expected. He was brushing down his horse with unnecessary vigor, his movements sharp and controlled. "Thank you," she said quietly from the doorway, "for the way you handled telling Emma. You made it sound like something to celebrate instead of a complication." Thomas didn't look up from his task. As far as Emma is concerned, it is something to celebrate. She doesn't need to know about the circumstances that brought this child into being. And as far as you're concerned, Thomas's hands stilled on the brush. As far as I'm concerned, it's an innocent child who deserves a chance at a good life. Whatever I think about the situation, it's not the baby's fault. Margaret stepped closer, drawn by the pain she could hear beneath his controlled words. "Thomas, I know you don't want to hear about the father, but there are things you should know about why I made the choices I did." "I told you I don't want to know, but you should, because right now you're imagining the worst possible scenarios, and the truth might be easier to live with than whatever you're thinking." Thomas finally turned to face her, his expression guarded. "What could you possibly tell me that would make this easier?" Margaret took a shaky breath, knowing she was taking a risk but unable to bear his silent condemnation any longer. "The father was my employer in Boston, Professor William Morrison. I worked as his housekeeper and tutor to his children. He was married, but he told me his wife didn't understand him, that he was planning to leave her. I was young and naive and believed him." Thomas's expression didn't change, but she saw something shift in his eyes. "When I told him about the baby, he said it was impossible, that I must have been with someone else. He accused me of trying to trap him and threatened to have me arrested for theft if I didn't leave his household immediately. I had nowhere to go, no family who would take me in. Your advertisement was the only hope I had for a respectable life." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft sounds of the horses shifting in their stalls. You were taken advantage of, Thomas said finally, his voice careful and neutral. I was foolish. I believed promises that were never meant to be kept. But Thomas, I want you to know that what I feel for you, what's grown between us these past months, that's real. It's not gratitude or convenience or fear. It's something I never expected to find. Thomas set down the brush and leaned against the stall door, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. Margaret, even if I could believe that, even if I could get past the deception, there's still the matter of trust. How do I know you won't keep other secrets from me? How do I know this is the only thing you've hidden? The question hit Margaret like a physical blow because she could see the genuine pain behind it. Thomas wasn't just angry about her pregnancy. He was devastated by the realization that the woman he'd been falling in love with wasn't who he thought she was. I can't prove that to you, she admitted. I can only give you my word, and I know that doesn't mean much to you right now. But Thomas, I swear to you on everything I hold sacred that there are no other secrets, nothing else hidden. What you see now is who I really am. Thomas studied her face in the lamplight, and for a moment Margaret thought she saw something soften in his expression. But then he shook his head and turned away. I need more time, Margaret. I can't just decide to trust you because you've explained your circumstances. Trust has to be rebuilt, and that takes time. Margaret nodded, blinking back tears. I understand. I'll wait as long as you need. December brought unexpected challenges that tested the fragile truce between them. A blizzard struck just before Christmas, trapping them in the house for 3 days with no way to reach town or even the other buildings on the ranch. Emma was delighted by the forced family time, but the close quarters made it impossible for Thomas to maintain his usual distance from Margaret. On the second day of the storm, Margaret's back began aching with an intensity that frightened her. At 6 months pregnant, she was large enough that simple tasks had become difficult, and the constant pain made her irritable and worried. She tried to hide her discomfort, but Thomas noticed her wincing as she attempted to lift a pot of soup. Sit down, he ordered, taking the pot from her hands. You're in pain. It's just my back. The baby's getting heavy. Thomas guided her to a chair, and after a moment's hesitation, moved behind her. May I? Margaret nodded, and his strong hands began working at the knots of tension in her shoulders and lower back. His touch was professional, careful, but Margaret couldn't help closing her eyes and leaning into the relief he provided. It was the first time he'd touched her with anything approaching tenderness since her confession. Better? He asked after several minutes. Much. Thank you. Emma, who had been watching the interaction with interest, suddenly spoke up. Papa used to rub Mama's back when she was expecting the babies that didn't come. He said it helped her feel better. The room went deadly silent. Thomas's hands stilled on Margaret's shoulders, and she could feel the tension radiating from him at his daughter's innocent observation. The comparison to Sarah and their lost children hung in the air like a reproach. That's enough, Emma, Thomas said quietly, stepping away from Margaret. But Emma, oblivious to the undercurrents, continued chattering. Mama always said that carrying a baby was hard work, and that's why papas needed to help. She said when their baby came, Papa would be the best daddy in the whole world because he took such good care of her. Margaret saw Thomas close his eyes briefly, pain etched clearly on his features. She wanted to comfort him, to somehow ease the burden of memories that Emma's words had stirred up, but she knew he wouldn't welcome her sympathy. That night, as the wind howled around the house and snow piled against the windows, Margaret lay awake listening to the storm and thinking about the conversation with Emma. She was beginning to understand the full weight of what her deception had cost Thomas. Not just his trust in her, but his faith in the possibility of new happiness. He'd lost 3 babies with Sarah, had watched his beloved wife suffer through repeated heartbreak, and had probably given up hope of ever having more children. Then Margaret had appeared, carrying new life but obtained through deception, forcing him to confront both hope and betrayal simultaneously. Around midnight she heard footsteps in the hallway and the soft sound of Thomas checking on Emma as he did every night. But instead of continuing to his own room, the footsteps paused outside Margaret's door. She held her breath, wondering if he might knock, might want to continue their earlier conversation. But after a long moment, the footsteps moved on, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts and the active baby who seemed determined to remind her of its presence with every movement. The next morning brought clear skies and the promise of rescue from their enforced isolation. Thomas immediately set about digging paths to the barn and other outbuildings, working with focused intensity that suggested he was as eager as Margaret to return to their normal routines of careful avoidance. But something had shifted during their 3 days together. Margaret had seen glimpses of the man she'd fallen in love with. His gentleness with Emma, his protective instincts toward Margaret herself, his fundamental decency that couldn't be entirely suppressed even by hurt and anger. As Christmas approached, Margaret found herself caught between hope and despair, hope that Thomas might eventually find a way to forgive her, and despair that she'd damaged their relationship beyond repair. The baby growing within her served as a constant reminder of both the new life she was bringing into their family and the deception that had made that gift feel more like a burden. On Christmas Eve, as she prepared a special dinner and tried to create a festive atmosphere for Emma's sake, Margaret couldn't help but wonder what the new year would bring. Would Thomas ever look at her again with warmth instead of wary distance? Would their marriage ever become more than a practical arrangement? Only time would tell, but as she felt the baby move beneath her heart, Margaret whispered a prayer that love might somehow find a way to triumph over the mistakes of the past. Christmas morning dawned cold and bright, with fresh snow sparkling, like diamonds, across the Colorado landscape. Margaret woke early, her back aching from the baby's increasingly demanding presence, and made her way to the kitchen to start preparations for their holiday meal. She'd spent weeks planning this day, hoping to create something special for Emma, despite the tension that still crackled between her and Thomas. The sound of Emma's excited squealing from the parlor brought a smile to Margaret's face despite her physical discomfort. Thomas had spent evenings in the barn carving a set of wooden dolls for his daughter, working by lamplight when he thought no one would notice. Margaret had sewn tiny dresses for the dolls, stitching by the fire while Emma slept, both parents secretly collaborating to ensure their child's happiness even as they struggled with their own fractured relationship. Margaret, come. See what Father Christmas brought me." Emma's voice carried through the house like church bells. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and made her way to the parlor, where she found Emma surrounded by her new dolls, their painted faces smiling up from intricate wooden features. Thomas stood by the window, watching his daughter's joy with an expression that mixed pride and melancholy. "They're beautiful, sweetheart," Margaret said, lowering herself carefully into a chair. At 7 months pregnant, even simple movements required planning and effort. Emma held up the largest doll, whose yellow yarn hair matched her own. "This one looks just like me, and this one," she picked up a smaller doll with brown hair, "could be the baby when it comes. Do you think the baby will have brown hair like Papa?" The innocent question hung in the air like smoke. Margaret felt Thomas's eyes on her, waiting to see how she would respond to their daughter's assumption about the baby's appearance. The truth was, Margaret had no idea what the child would look like. Professor Morrison had been fair-haired and pale, quite different from Thomas's darker coloring. "We'll have to wait and see," Margaret said carefully. "Babies sometimes surprise everyone with how they look." Thomas cleared his throat. "Emma, why don't you go play with your dolls while Margaret and I finish preparing dinner?" As Emma settled, Contentedly on the rug with her new treasures, Thomas approached Margaret with something in his hands, a small wrapped package that he set on the table beside her chair. "I made this for you," he said quietly, his voice holding none of the warmth it once had, but lacking its recent coldness as well. Margaret unwrapped the package with trembling fingers, revealing a beautiful wooden cradle, small enough to sit beside a bed, but crafted with exquisite care. Every surface was smooth as silk, and he'd carved delicate flowers along the headboard. It was clearly the work of many hours, made by hands that understood both wood and love. "Thomas, it's perfect," Margaret's voice caught as she ran, her fingers over the polished wood. "When did you have time to make this?" "Evenings, mostly. I thought the baby would need somewhere safe to sleep." The gift represented more than just practical consideration. It was an acknowledgement of the child's place in their family, an acceptance that went beyond duty to something approaching tenderness. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes as she realized what this meant. "Thank you. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever owned." Thomas nodded stiffly and turned away, but not before Margaret caught a glimpse of something soft in his expression. "Dinner should be ready soon. Emma will want to show off her dolls to the men when they come in from the barn." The holiday meal passed more pleasantly than Margaret had dared hope. Jake Morrison and his son Billy joined them, along with old Pete, creating enough jovial conversation to mask the awkwardness between the married couple. Emma chattered endlessly about her dolls and the coming baby, already making plans for all the things she would teach her new sibling. It was Jake who brought up the subject that had been lurking in everyone's mind. "Mrs. Henderson, when do you expect the little one to arrive? We'll want to make sure Doc Harrison knows to be available." Margaret felt her cheeks warm under the scrutiny of the gathered men. "Late January, I believe. Perhaps early February." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "First babies can be unpredictable. Could come early, could be late. Best to be prepared either way." Margaret caught Thomas's eye across the table and saw understanding pass between them. Jake was providing cover for the baby's early arrival, creating a plausible explanation that would satisfy any gossips in town. The kindness of the gesture from a man who clearly suspected the truth made Margaret's throat tight with gratitude. The week between Christmas and New Year passed quietly, with Thomas making an obvious effort to be more present in the house. He no longer spent every evening in the barn, though he still maintained careful distance from Margaret. When she struggled with household tasks due to her size, he would quietly take over without comment or fanfare. It was during one of these moments, as Thomas wordlessly took a heavy pot from her hands, that Margaret felt compelled to break the silence that had defined their interactions for months. "I know you're doing this for the baby's sake," she said quietly, watching him lift the pot onto the stove with ease. "But I want you to know that I don't take your kindness for granted." Thomas paused in his movements. "I'm not doing it just for the baby." The admission was so quiet Margaret almost missed it. She turned to study his profile, searching for clues to his meaning. Then why? Thomas was quiet for so long that Margaret thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Because despite everything, I still care what happens to you. I wish I didn't, but I do." The confession hung between them like a bridge, fragile, uncertain, but offering the possibility of connection. Margaret felt her heart leap with hope, even as she tried to contain her expectations. "Thomas, don't read too much into it," he said quickly, turning away from her. "Caring about someone and trusting them are different things." Before Margaret could respond, Emma burst through the kitchen door with news that would change everything. "Papa, there's a man at the door asking for Margaret. He says he's her friend from Boston." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. Through the kitchen window, She could see a familiar figure on the front porch, the same dark-haired man who had watched her wedding from the back of the church. Professor William Morrison had found her. Thomas's expression went from confusion to grim understanding as he took in Margaret's obvious terror. "Who is he, Margaret?" Margaret's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. She couldn't seem to form words, couldn't make her mind work past the panic that was flooding her system. Morrison was here. After all these months, he'd tracked her down to this remote Colorado ranch. "Margaret," Thomas's voice was sharp with urgency. "Who is that man?" "It's him," she whispered. "The baby's father, Professor Morrison." Thomas's face went white, then flushed with anger so intense that Margaret took an involuntary step backward. "Here? Now?" Emma, oblivious to the adult's distress, tugged at her father's sleeve. "Papa, should I tell him to come in? He seems very nice, and he brought a present for Margaret." "No," Thomas said sharply, then moderated his tone for his daughter's sake. "Emma, go to your room and stay there until I tell you otherwise." "But Papa—" "Now, Emma." The child's face crumpled at her father's harsh tone, but she obeyed, casting worried glances over her shoulder as she left the kitchen. Margaret watched her go, her heart breaking at the thought of how this unexpected arrival might shatter the fragile stability they'd built. Thomas moved to the window and studied the man on their porch with the intensity of a hunter sizing up prey. Morrison was well dressed as always, his expensive coat and polished boots marking him as a man of means and education. He looked completely out of place against the rustic backdrop of the ranch. "What does he want?" Thomas asked, his voice deadly. "Quiet, I don't know. I never expected. I thought he'd forgotten about me completely." Thomas turned from the window to face her, and Margaret saw something in his expression that chilled her more than Morrison's unexpected appearance. It was the look of a man who'd been betrayed once, and now faced the possibility of deeper deception. "Did you know he was coming? Have you been in contact with him?" "No, Thomas, I swear to you I had no idea. I haven't heard from him since the day he threw me out of his house." A knock at the front door echoed through the house, followed by Morrison's cultured voice calling out, "Mrs. Henderson? Margaret? I know you're in there. I've traveled a very long way to speak with you." Thomas studied Margaret's face with laser intensity, clearly weighing whether to believe her shock and fear. After a moment that felt like eternity, he nodded curtly. "Stay here. I'll handle this." "Thomas, please. Stay here, Margaret. Whatever happens, don't come out until I tell you to." Margaret sank into a kitchen chair as Thomas strode toward the front door, her hands pressed protectively over her belly. The baby was moving restlessly, as if sensing her distress, and she found herself whispering reassurances to both the child and herself. Through the walls, she could hear Thomas opening the front door and the murmur of male voices, Thomas's low and controlled, Morrison's smoother and more educated. She strained to make out words, but they were speaking too quietly for her to understand the conversation. Minutes passed, like hours. Margaret's imagination ran wild with possibilities, each worse than the last. Had Morrison come to claim the baby, to demand she return to Boston with him, to create a scandal that would destroy the fragile peace she'd found with Thomas and Emma? Finally, she heard the front door close and Thomas's footsteps returning to the kitchen. His face was a mask of controlled fury, and in his hand he held an envelope. "He's gone," Thomas said without preamble. "For now." What did he want? Thomas set the envelope on the table between them. "He wanted to give you this. He said it would explain everything." Margaret stared at the envelope as if it contained a snake. Her name was written across the front in Morrison's familiar handwriting, the same script that had once penned love letters filled with false promises. Did he say anything else? Thomas's jaw worked, as if he were chewing over words too bitter to speak. He said he'd made a mistake, that he'd been thinking about you and the child. He's staying at the hotel in town and expects an answer by tomorrow. Margaret felt sick. An answer to what? Read the letter, Margaret, but know this. Whatever that man wants, whatever he's offering, it doesn't change anything between us. You made your choice when you married me, and he made his when he threw you out of his house. With shaking hands, Margaret opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. Morrison's words seemed to burn themselves into her. A vision as she read. My dearest Margaret, I have made a grievous error in judgment and can no longer live with the consequences of my hasty actions. After months of reflection, I realize that my accusations were born of panic rather than reason. I know the child you carry is mine, and I am prepared to do what honor demands. My wife has agreed to a discreet divorce, and I am now free to offer you what you deserve: marriage, legitimacy, and a life of comfort in Boston society. The child will bear my name and inherit my estate. You need no longer suffer the hardships of frontier life or the shame of your current circumstances. I await your answer at the Millfield Hotel. We can leave for Boston as early as tomorrow if you agree to my proposal. Your devoted William Morrison. Margaret's hands trembled so violently that the letter fluttered to the floor. Morrison was offering her everything she'd once dreamed of: legitimacy, security, a father for her child who wouldn't be burdened by questions of timing or parentage. It was the solution to every problem that had driven her to Colorado in the first place. But as she sat in the warm kitchen of the Henderson Ranch, surrounded by the evidence of the life she'd built here, Margaret realized that Morrison's offer felt more like a trap than a rescue. This was the home she'd chosen, the family she'd grown to love, the man whose respect and affection she'd worked so hard to earn. Thomas was watching her with an expression of careful neutrality, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the white-knuckled grip of his hands on the back of a chair. He was preparing himself to lose her, she realized. Preparing to watch her walk away with the man who could give her everything Thomas couldn't: a legitimate marriage without the stain of deception, a father for the baby who wouldn't have to pretend about its origins. "What are you going to do?" Thomas asked quietly. Margaret looked up at him, this good man who had shown her kindness when she deserved judgment, who had offered her sanctuary when she had nowhere else to turn, who had promised to love her child as his own, despite the pain. It caused him. "I'm going to tell him no," she said firmly. "I'm going to tell him that I'm exactly where I belong." For the first time in months, Thomas's carefully controlled expression cracked, revealing a glimpse of the hope and relief he'd been holding back. But before he could respond, they heard Emma's voice calling from her room. "Papa! Margaret! There are more men outside, lots of them." Through the kitchen window, Margaret saw what appeared to be half the men in Millfield riding up their lane, their faces grim with purpose. At their head rode Sheriff Wilson, his badge glinting in the afternoon sun. Thomas cursed under his breath. Whatever Morrison told them, it wasn't the truth. As the riders approached the house, Margaret realized that her moment of decision had been too late. Whatever Morrison's real intentions, he'd clearly set events in motion that would force her, and one way or another, the battle for her future and her family was about to begin. Sheriff Wilson dismounted from his horse with the deliberate movements of a man carrying unwelcome news. His weathered face was set in grim lines as he approached the porch, flanked by several men Margaret recognized from town, the banker, the general store owner, and Pastor Williams among them. The sight of the pastor filled her with particular dread, as his presence suggested moral judgment was about to be passed. Thomas stepped onto the porch to meet them, his posture radiating protective authority despite the obvious tension in his shoulders. "Sheriff Wilson, gentlemen, what brings you out to my ranch on New Year's Eve?" Sheriff Wilson removed his hat, his gray hair disheveled from the winter wind. "Thomas, I'm afraid we have a delicate situation that requires discussion. May we come inside?" "That depends on the nature of your business. It concerns your wife and some serious allegations that have been brought to our attention." Margaret felt the world tilt around her as she pressed herself against the kitchen window, straining to hear every word. Through the glass, she could see Morrison hanging back near the barn, clearly having guided this delegation to her doorstep. His expensive coat stood out starkly against the rough-hewn buildings, marking him as the outsider who had brought chaos to their carefully constructed peace. Thomas's voice carried clearly in the cold air. "What kind of allegations?" Pastor Williams stepped forward, his kind face troubled with obvious reluctance. "Thomas, a gentleman from Boston has come forward with claims that Mrs. Henderson is legally married to him. He says she fled their home while expecting his child and entered into a fraudulent marriage with you." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. Morrison hadn't come to offer her an honorable escape. He'd come to destroy the life she'd built, to force her return through scandal and legal threats. Her hands moved instinctively to her belly, where the baby seemed to sense her distress with increased movement. Thomas's response was controlled but deadly. "I see. And what evidence does this gentleman present to support such claims?" "Sheriff," Wilson shifted uncomfortably. "He has letters written in Mrs. Henderson's hand, acknowledging their relationship and the pregnancy. He also has statements from witnesses in Boston who can testify to their association." Margaret closed her eyes, remembering the foolish letters she'd written to Morrison during their affair, pouring out her heart to a man who had been collecting evidence against her, even as he made promises he never intended to keep. Those private words, written in love and trust, were now being used as weapons against her. "Furthermore," the banker added with obvious distaste, "if these allegations are true, it means Mrs. Henderson committed bigamy when she married you, Thomas. That's a serious crime that could result in imprisonment." Emma's voice called from her room again, frightened by the commotion. "Papa, what's happening? Why are all those men here?" Thomas's jaw tightened at the fear in his daughter's voice. "Sheriff, I'd prefer to continue this conversation away from my home. My daughter doesn't need to hear these accusations." "I'm afraid that's not possible, Thomas. We need to speak with Mrs. Henderson directly. These are serious charges that require immediate resolution." Margaret knew she had no choice. With trembling hands, she opened the kitchen door and stepped onto the porch, her pregnancy making her movements awkward and her condition impossible to hide. The assembled men's eyes moved to her belly with expressions ranging from pity to judgment, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks despite the cold air. "Gentlemen," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice, "I understand you have questions for me." Morrison stepped forward from his position near the barn, his face arranged in an expression of concerned righteousness that made Margaret's stomach turn. "Margaret, my dear, I've been so worried about you. When you disappeared from Boston, I feared the worst. I'm just grateful to find you safe and well." The endearment, spoken in front of her husband and these men of the community, was clearly calculated to establish his claim on her. Margaret felt Thomas stiffen beside her, his protective instincts warring with his own hurt and confusion. "Mr. Morrison," Margaret said carefully, "I'm surprised to see you here. I thought I made my circumstances clear when I left Boston. You were distraught, understandably so given your condition, but surely you can see that our child deserves to know its true father, to bear its rightful name. I've come to make things right between us." Sheriff Wilson stepped between them, his hand resting on his gun belt in a gesture that was both casual and threatening. "Mrs. Henderson, Professor Morrison claims that you are legally his wife, according to common law marriage recognized in Massachusetts. He says you lived as man and wife for over a year before coming to Colorado." Margaret felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Morrison was twisting their affair into something it had never been, using laws she didn't fully understand to create a legal claim that could destroy everything she'd built with Thomas. "That's not true," she said firmly. "Professor Morrison was married to another woman the entire time I knew him. I was his employee, nothing more in the eyes of the law. Morrison's expression shifted to one of pained disappointment. Margaret, please don't compound this situation with further deceptions. You know as well as I do that we presented ourselves as husband and wife to the community. Mrs. Patterson next door can testify that you introduced yourself as Mrs. Morrison on several occasions. Margaret's heart sank as she remembered the times Morrison had insisted she use his name when dealing with tradesmen or neighbors, claiming it would make household management easier. At the time, she'd thought it was romantic proof of his commitment to their future together. Now she realized he'd been laying a legal trap that he could spring whenever it suited his purposes. Thomas spoke for the first time since the accusations began, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. Even if what you claim is true, Professor, it seems convenient that you've only now decided to assert your marital rights. Why didn't you come forward when Margaret first arrived in Colorado? Why wait until after she'd married me? Morrison's mask of righteousness slipped slightly, revealing a flash of the calculating mind beneath. I only recently learned of Margaret's whereabouts. It took considerable effort and expense to track her to this remote location. I came as soon as I possibly could. Pastor Williams cleared his throat uncomfortably. The question before us is a legal one that I'm not qualified to judge. However, if Mrs. Henderson was indeed married to Professor Morrison when she wed you, Thomas, then her marriage to you is invalid. The child she carries would be legitimate under Professor Morrison's name, but illegitimate under yours. The cruel irony of the situation wasn't lost on Margaret. Morrison was using the very laws that had driven her from Boston to force her return, threatening to make her child a bastard if she refused to acknowledge their supposed marriage while promising legitimacy if she complied. Emma's frightened voice called out again, and this time she appeared in the doorway despite Thomas's earlier instructions. Papa, I'm scared. Why is everyone shouting? The sight of the innocent child seemed to galvanize Thomas. That's enough, he said firmly. Whatever legal questions need to be resolved can be handled through proper channels, not through intimidation at my front door. My family has done nothing wrong, and I won't have my daughter terrorized by these proceedings. Sheriff Wilson nodded reluctantly. Thomas is right. This matter requires careful legal review, not a mob tribunal. Professor Morrison, you'll need to file formal papers with the territorial court if you wish to pursue your claims. Until then, Mrs. Henderson remains a resident of Colorado and under the protection of our laws. Morrison's carefully composed expression cracked, revealing anger and frustration. Sheriff, surely you can see the urgency of this situation. Every day that passes makes the deception more egregious. The child Margaret carries is mine by right, and I won't be denied my paternal claims by frontier bureaucracy. The law is the law, Professor, whether in Boston or Colorado. You'll follow proper procedures or find yourself charged with harassment. Margaret watched the exchange with growing hope, but Morrison wasn't finished. He reached into his coat and withdrew another document, this one bearing official seals and ribbons. Perhaps this will clarify matters, he said with renewed confidence. I've already filed a petition with the territorial court in Denver, claiming custody of my unborn child and demanding the annulment of Mrs. Henderson's fraudulent marriage. These papers give me the right to ensure my wife and child return to Boston, where they belong. Sheriff Wilson examined the document with obvious reluctance, his expression growing more troubled as he read. This appears to be legitimate, though. I'll need to verify it with the territorial authorities. In the meantime, it does complicate the situation significantly. Margaret felt the walls closing in around her. Morrison had come prepared for every contingency, armed with legal documents that could force her compliance regardless of her personal wishes. The life she'd built with Thomas and Emma was crumbling before her eyes, destroyed by a man who had already proven he cared nothing for her happiness or well-being. Thomas took her arm gently, his touch providing strength even as everything else fell apart. Margaret doesn't have to make any decisions today. Whatever these papers say, she has the right to legal representation and time to consider her options. Actually, Morrison said with cold satisfaction, the court order specifies that Margaret must remain within territorial jurisdiction pending resolution of the case. She's not free to leave Colorado, but she's also not free to continue this charade of a marriage. The law recognizes my prior claim. Dr. Harrison, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. Professor Morrison, regardless of legal technicalities, Mrs. Henderson is in an advanced stage of pregnancy. Any disruption to her living situation could endanger both mother and child. Surely your concern for their welfare outweighs your desire for immediate resolution. Morrison's expression softened calculatedly. Of course I'm concerned for Margaret's health. That's precisely why I want her under proper medical care in Boston, rather than stuck in this primitive environment. No offense intended, Doctor, but surely you must agree that the medical facilities in Boston are superior to anything available on the frontier. The insult to Dr. Harrison, and by extension the entire community, created a ripple of anger among the assembled men. Margaret saw several faces harden with resentment at Morrison's condescending attitude, and she realized his arrogance might be his undoing. Thomas stepped closer to Morrison, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Professor, you're a guest in our community, but that courtesy has limits. I suggest you moderate your tone when discussing the people who call this place home. Morrison straightened his shoulders, trying to project authority, despite being surrounded by men who clearly disliked him. I meant no disrespect, Mr. Henderson. I'm simply stating facts about the superior resources available in Boston for Margaret. And our child's care. Your child, Thomas's control finally snapped. You threw Margaret out of your house when she told you about the pregnancy. You accused her of lying and threatened to have her arrested. Now you want to claim paternal rights? The outburst revealed more than Thomas probably intended, confirming Morrison's allegations about the pregnancy's timing while simultaneously exposing his cruelty toward Margaret. The assembled men exchanged glances, clearly reassessing the situation. In light of this new information, Morrison seized the advantage immediately. I was shocked by the news, naturally, but I've had time to reflect on my responsibilities, and I'm prepared to do what's right. Can you say the same, Mr. Henderson? Can you honestly claim you entered your marriage with full knowledge of Margaret's condition? The question hung in the air like a sword. Thomas's silence spoke volumes, and Margaret saw understanding dawn on the faces around them. The community leaders were beginning to piece together the truth, that she had indeed deceived Thomas about her pregnancy, that Morrison's claims might have legal merit, that their marriage might be built on deception. Pastor Williams cleared his throat sadly. I think we've heard enough to understand the complexity of this situation. Thomas, Margaret, I suggest you both seek legal counsel immediately. These matters are beyond what can be resolved through community discussion. As the men began to disperse, mounting their horses with obvious reluctance to leave the drama unresolved, Morrison approached Margaret one final time. His voice was low enough that only she and Thomas could hear his words. You have 24 hours to consider my offer. Margaret, after that, I'll pursue every legal remedy available to ensure you and our child return to Boston where you belong. Don't force me to destroy the reputation of these good people who have shown you kindness. The threat was clear. Morrison would drag the entire community through a scandalous legal battle if Margaret didn't comply voluntarily. She watched him mount his horse and ride away with the others, leaving behind the shattered remnants of her carefully constructed new life. Thomas stood beside her in the gathering dusk, his face etched with a pain that went beyond personal betrayal, to encompass the potential destruction of everything he held dear. Emma peered out from the doorway, her young face filled with confusion and fear at the adult drama she couldn't understand. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, Margaret realized that the next 24 hours would determine not just her own fate, but the future of the family she'd grown to love more than life itself. The house felt different after the men left, as if the very walls had absorbed the tension and accusation that hung in the air like smoke. Thomas closed the front door with deliberate care, his movements controlled in a way that spoke of barely contained emotion. Emma had retreated to her room without being asked, her child's instincts recognizing that the adults needed space to navigate the crisis that had descended upon their home. Margaret remained by the window, watching the last of the riders disappear into the gathering dusk. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass, a woman heavy with child, surrounded by the comfortable furnishings of a home she might soon lose. The irony wasn't lost on her that Morrison's arrival had finally given her what she'd thought she wanted: Thomas's full attention and concern. But it had come at a price that might destroy them all. "We need to talk," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying none of the anger she'd expected. Instead, there was a weariness that seemed to emanate from his very bones. Margaret turned from the window, her hands instinctively moving to her belly where the baby was active, as if sensing its mother's distress. "I know what you're going to say. Do you?" Thomas moved to stand near the fireplace, putting the width of the room between them. "Because I'm not sure I know what I'm going to say myself." The admission surprised her. She'd expected accusations, demands for explanations, perhaps anger at the way Morrison's arrival had exposed their private business to the entire community. Instead, Thomas seemed to be struggling with something deeper, more fundamental than simple betrayal. "I should have told you about him from the beginning," Margaret said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Not just about the baby, but about who the father was, what kind of man he is. I was a coward, Thomas. I was so afraid of losing what we'd built that I couldn't bring myself to risk it with the truth." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire that crackled in the grate. When he finally spoke, his words carried a weight that suggested he'd been thinking about them for hours. "Margaret, I've been asking myself the same question over and over since that man appeared on our porch. If you had told me everything from the beginning, about Morrison, about the circumstances of your pregnancy, about the kind of man who could throw a pregnant woman onto the street, would I have still married you?" Margaret's breath caught in her throat. It was the question she'd been afraid to ask herself, the fear that had driven every decision she'd made since arriving in Colorado. "And what answer did you come to?" Thomas turned to face her fully, and Margaret saw something in his expression that she couldn't quite identify. Pain, certainly, but something else as well, something that looked almost like resolve. "I think I would have married you anyway," he said quietly. "Not out of pity or charity, but because even knowing what I know now, I can't imagine my life without you in it. You've become part of this family, part of me, in ways I didn't expect when I first placed that advertisement." The words hit Margaret with such force that she had to grip the back of a chair to steady herself. "Thomas!" "But here's what I can't reconcile," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "If Morrison has legal documents that prove you're his, wife, if he can demonstrate a prior claim to you and the child, then none of what I feel matters. The law doesn't care about our emotions or our plans for the future." Margaret sank into the chair she'd been gripping, the weight of her pregnancy and the day's revelations finally overwhelming her ability to remain standing. "So you think I should go with him?" "I think you should do what protects you and the baby. If fighting Morrison means you could face charges of bigamy, if it means the child could be declared illegitimate, then maybe his offer is the practical choice." The words were spoken with such careful neutrality that Margaret knew they were costing Thomas everything he had. He was prepared to sacrifice his own happiness to ensure her safety, even after everything that had happened between them. "And what about Emma? What about you?" Thomas's composure cracked slightly, revealing the pain beneath his controlled exterior. "Emma and I survived before you came to us. We'll survive after you're gone." "That's not what I asked." Thomas moved to the window where Margaret had been standing, his back to her as he looked out at the darkening landscape. "What do you want me to say, Margaret? That losing you would tear my heart out? That I've grown to love you despite everything, maybe because of everything? That the thought of watching you walk away with another man makes me want to tear this house apart with my bare hands?" The raw honesty in his voice made Margaret's eyes fill with tears. "Yes, that's exactly what I want you to say." "Then you've heard it. But wanting something and being able to keep it are different things entirely." Before Margaret could respond, a soft knock at the kitchen door interrupted their conversation. Thomas frowned, moving to answer it with obvious caution. Margaret heard the murmur of voices, then Thomas returned with Jake Morrison behind him. The older man removed his hat, his weathered face creased with concern. "Forgive the intrusion, folks, but I thought you should know that Professor Fellow is holding court at the saloon, buying drinks and telling anyone who'll listen about his version of events." Margaret felt her heart sink. Morrison was building public opinion in his favor, creating a narrative that would make any legal challenge even more difficult. "What's he saying?" Thomas asked grimly. Jake shifted uncomfortably. "Claims he's a respectable professor who made an honest mistake, that he panicked when Margaret told him about the baby, but came to his senses and followed her here to make things right. He's painting himself as the wronged party, saying Margaret ran away and tricked you into marriage to hide her shame. And people are believing him? Some are. He's got a smooth way of talking, and he looks the part of a gentleman. Plus, he's not shy about spending money, which always makes folks more inclined to listen." Margaret closed her eyes, imagining the scene at the saloon. Morrison had always been skilled at manipulation, at presenting himself in whatever light best served his purposes. In Boston, he'd been the concerned professor protecting his reputation. Now he was the reformed suitor seeking to do right by the woman he loved. "There's more," Jake continued reluctantly. "He's also spreading word that he's got documentation proving his marriage to Margaret, and that any children she has belong to him by law. Says he's prepared to take the matter to the territorial courts if necessary." Thomas's jaw tightened. "He's trying to force public opinion against us before any legal proceedings begin. That's how I see it. But Thomas, there's something else you should know. Some of the men aren't buying his story. Sheriff Wilson looked mighty uncomfortable with the whole business, and Pastor Williams pulled me aside to say he thinks there's more to this than meets the eye." Margaret looked up hopefully. "What did he mean?" Jake glanced between Margaret and Thomas, clearly weighing his words carefully. "Pastor Williams has officiated at a lot of weddings over the years, and he says he's never seen a man pursue a woman with such determination, unless there was something else at stake. He thinks Morrison's got reasons beyond love or duty for wanting you back." The observation sent a chill through Margaret as she remembered Morrison's letter, his mention of his wife agreeing to a divorce, his sudden willingness to acknowledge paternity. What had changed in his circumstances that made claiming her and the baby suddenly advantageous? "There's one more thing," Jake said, his voice dropping to near whisper. "Billy was in town when Morrison arrived, and he heard him talking to someone at the telegraph office. Couldn't make out all the words, but he heard something about money and a will." Thomas and Margaret exchanged glances, understanding passing between them. Morrison's pursuit wasn't about love or even responsibility. It was about some financial advantage that claiming Margaret and the baby would provide. "Jake," Thomas said slowly, "would Billy be willing to testify about what he heard?" "I reckon so, if it came to that. But Thomas, you need to understand what you'd be getting into. Fighting this man means exposing your family to months of legal proceedings, public scandal, and financial costs that could ruin you. Even if you win, the damage to your reputation and Margaret's might be irreparable." Margaret watched Thomas process this information, seeing the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He was being asked to risk everything: his farm, his standing in the community, his daughter's future, for a woman who had already deceived him once. "It should be my decision," Margaret said quietly. "I'm the one Morrison is claiming. I should be the one to choose whether to fight or surrender." Both men turned to look at her, and Margaret saw her own resolve reflected in their faces. She struggled to her feet, her pregnancy making the movement awkward, but her determination lending her strength. "I've been running from William Morrison's consequences since the day I left Boston. I've let fear and shame drive every choice I've made, and look where it's brought us. Maybe it's time I stopped running and started fighting." Thomas studied her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed and vulnerable. "Margaret, if we fight this and lose, you could face criminal charges. The baby could be taken away from you entirely. Are you prepared for that risk?" Margaret thought of Emma's trusting face, of the wooden cradle Thomas had carved with his own hands, of the life they'd begun to build together despite its imperfect foundations. Then she thought of Morrison's calculating eyes and his assumption that she would simply surrender because he demanded it. "I'm prepared to fight for my family," she said firmly, "for the family I chose, not the one that's being forced on me." Jake nodded approvingly. "That's the spirit, but you'll need more than courage to beat Morrison at his own game. You'll need strategy, and you'll need allies." "What do you suggest?" Thomas asked. "First, we need to find out what's really driving Morrison's sudden interest in claiming Margaret and the baby. If it's about money or inheritance, there might be people in Boston who can shed light on his true motives. Second, we need to build a case for the legitimacy of your marriage and Margaret's standing in the community. Character witnesses, testimony about your relationship, evidence of the life you've built together." Margaret felt a spark of hope at Jake's practical approach. "How do we do that?" "We start by documenting everything. Every letter you exchanged before Margaret came to Colorado, every witness to your wedding, every person who can testify to the genuine nature of your relationship. And we find out everything we can about Morrison's background and his current circumstances." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, then nodded decisively. "All right. If we're going to fight, we fight to win. But Margaret, I need to know that you're committed to this battle regardless of the personal cost, because once we start down this path, there's no turning back." Margaret looked around the kitchen that had become her sanctuary, thinking of all the mornings she'd prepared breakfast here, all the evenings she'd spent mending clothes by lamplight, while Thomas read to Emma from his collection of books. This was her home now. These were her people, and she wasn't going to let Morrison's greed and manipulation destroy what they'd built together. "I'm committed," she said firmly. "Whatever it takes." Jake clapped his hat back on his head with satisfaction. "Then we'd better get started. Morrison might have legal documents and Boston sophistication on his side, but we've got something he doesn't: the truth, and a community that believes in fighting for what's right." As Jake prepared to leave, he paused at the door with one final piece of advice. "Thomas, Margaret, you need to understand that the next few weeks are going to test everything you think you know about each other and about your marriage. Morrison's going to try to drive wedges between you, to make you doubt each other's motives and loyalties. Don't let him succeed." After Jake left, Margaret and Thomas stood alone in their kitchen. the weight of the decision they'd made settling around them like a mantle. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the windows and reminding them that winter was far from over. "Are you sure about this?" Thomas asked quietly. "Once word gets out that we're fighting Morrison's claims, there'll be no privacy, no peace until it's resolved." Margaret moved closer to him, close enough to see the doubt and fear in his eyes, despite his brave words. "Thomas, I've spent months hiding the truth from you because I was afraid of losing what we had. I won't make that mistake again. Whatever happens in this fight, we face it together, with complete honesty between us." Thomas studied her face in the lamplight, and slowly, carefully, he reached out to cup her cheek in his hand. It was the first truly tender gesture he'd offered her since learning about her pregnancy, and Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes at the gentle contact. "Then we fight," he said simply, "and we fight to win." Outside, the Colorado wind howled across the plains, carrying with it the promise of storms to come. But inside the Henderson home, a family was preparing to stand together against whatever forces threatened to tear them apart. The battle for their future was about to begin in earnest. 3 weeks later, the territorial courthouse in Denver buzzed with anticipation as the case of Morrison versus Henderson was called to order. Margaret sat beside Thomas at the defendant's table, her hands folded over her 8-month belly, the baby inside restless, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Across the aisle, Morrison cut an impressive figure in his expensive suit, every inch the respectable Boston professor seeking justice. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of preparation and revelation. Jake's suggestion to investigate Morrison's background had borne unexpected fruit when Pastor Williams reached out to colleagues in Boston. What they'd discovered had changed everything. Morrison's wife hadn't agreed to a divorce out of sudden generosity. She died unexpectedly, leaving behind a substantial inheritance that would only pass to Morrison if he could prove legitimate paternity of an heir. His pursuit of Margaret wasn't about love or responsibility. It was about claiming a fortune that required him to produce a child within a specific time frame outlined in his deceased wife's will. "Your Honor," began Morrison's attorney, a polished man who spoke with calculated precision, "my client seeks only to reclaim his lawful wife and unborn child, who were taken from him through deception and fraud. Mrs. Henderson fled their established home in Boston while carrying his child, then entered into an illegal marriage with the defendant. Judge Harrison, no relation to their local doctor, was a stern man with silver hair and keen eyes that seemed to see through every facade. He'd listened patiently to the opening arguments, but Margaret could read nothing from his impassive expression. Thomas's attorney, a younger man named David Sterling, whom they'd hired with money borrowed against the ranch, stood to respond. "Your Honor, we will prove that Professor Morrison never had a legal claim to Mrs. Henderson. Their relationship was that of employer and employee, corrupted by Morrison's abuse of power and false promises. When Mrs. Henderson discovered his true character, she fled not as a runaway wife, but as a victim seeking safety." The first day of testimony revealed the ugly truth of Margaret's time in Boston. Character witnesses testified to Morrison's reputation for pursuing his female employees, his pattern of making promises he never intended to keep. Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor Morrison had claimed would support his case, instead testified that she'd only known Margaret as Miss Sullivan, the professor's housekeeper, never as his wife. But Morrison's side wasn't without ammunition. They produced Margaret's letters, intimate correspondence that, taken out of context, could be interpreted as evidence of a committed relationship. They presented financial records showing Morrison had supported Margaret's living expenses, painting a picture of a kept woman rather than an employee. The turning point came on the second day when Sterling called an unexpected witness. A telegraph operator from Boston testified that Morrison had sent urgent communications to Denver immediately after his wife's death, inquiring about territorial marriage laws and the legitimacy of children born to common law unions. He wasn't looking for his lost love, Sterling argued. He was researching how to manufacture a legal claim to Mrs. Henderson's child for financial gain. Morrison's attorney objected vigorously, but the damage was done. The judge's expression had shifted from neutral attention to obvious skepticism. The most powerful testimony came from Margaret herself. 8 months pregnant and visibly nervous, she took the stand and told her story with quiet dignity. She described her desperate circumstances, Morrison's betrayal, and her genuine feelings for Thomas and Emma. Professor Morrison never mentioned marriage during our entire association, she testified. When I told him about the pregnancy, he accused me of lying and threatened to have me arrested if I didn't leave immediately. I came to Colorado not as a runaway wife, but as a woman seeking a chance to rebuild her life honorably. Under cross-examination, Morrison's attorney tried to shake her testimony, but Margaret held firm. When he suggested she was simply a fortune hunter who had targeted Thomas for his property, her response rang with genuine emotion. "If I were seeking fortune, sir, I would hardly have chosen a rancher in Colorado over a professor in Boston. I chose Thomas Henderson because he offered me something Professor Morrison never did: respect, honesty, and genuine affection." Thomas testified about their courtship through letters, their wedding, and his growing love for Margaret, despite learning about her pregnancy. His words were simple but powerful, describing a marriage built on mutual respect and deepening affection. "Did you know about Mrs. Henderson's pregnancy when you married her?" Sterling asked. "No, I did not. But when I learned the truth, I realized it didn't change how I felt about her. Margaret had become part of my family, part of my heart. The child she carries will be loved and raised as my own, regardless of its biological parentage." Emma, deemed old enough to testify despite her youth, provided the most touching moment of the trial. When asked about Margaret's role in their family, her answer was immediate and heartfelt. "Margaret is my mama now. She takes care of me when I'm sick, helps me with my letters, and makes our house feel like a home again. I don't care about any old baby's father. I just want my family to stay together." The judge called for a recess after Emma's testimony, clearly moved by the child's simple sincerity. During the break, Morrison approached Margaret privately, his mask of righteousness finally slipping to reveal desperation beneath. "This doesn't have to end badly for either of us," he said urgently. "Come back to Boston with me, help me claim the inheritance, and I'll give you a comfortable life. Fight me and you'll lose everything: your reputation, your marriage, maybe even the child." Margaret looked at this man who had once seemed so important to her, seeing clearly now the selfishness and manipulation that had always defined him. "William, I already have everything I want. The question is whether you're prepared to lose what you're really after." Her quiet confidence seemed to unnerve him more than any angry response could have. When court reconvened, Judge Harrison delivered his verdict with the measured tone of a man who had considered every angle. "This court finds that no valid marriage ever existed between Professor Morrison and Mrs. Margaret Henderson. Their relationship was that of employer and employee, complicated by Professor Morrison's abuse of his position and Mrs. Henderson's vulnerable circumstances." Margaret felt Thomas's hand find hers under the table, squeezing gently as the judge continued. "Furthermore, this court finds Professor Morrison's current claims to be motivated not by genuine paternal concern, but by financial interests related to his deceased wife's estate. His pursuit of Mrs. Henderson appears calculated to manufacture a legal claim to her unborn child for inheritance purposes." Morrison's face went pale as his carefully constructed case crumbled. Therefore, this court recognizes the legal validity of the marriage between Thomas Henderson and Margaret Henderson. Any children born to this union are legitimate and bear the Henderson name. Professor Morrison has no legal standing to claim either Mrs. Henderson or her child. The courtroom erupted in quiet celebration from the Henderson supporters who had made the journey to Denver. Margaret felt tears of relief streaming down her face as Thomas gathered her into his arms, holding her close as their victory sank in. But Judge Harrison wasn't finished. However, this court is also compelled to note that Professor Morrison's pursuit of Mrs. Henderson across state lines, his attempts to manipulate legal proceedings for financial gain, and his harassment of a pregnant woman suggest conduct unbecoming of his professional position. I am forwarding my findings to the appropriate authorities in Massachusetts for their consideration. As they left the courthouse, Morrison made one final attempt to salvage something from his failed scheme. "Margaret, you're making a mistake. That frontier life will be hard on you and the child. I could still offer you comfort, security." Thomas stepped between them, his voice calm but implacable. "Professor Morrison, my wife has made her choice. I suggest you respect it and return to Boston before you face additional legal difficulties." Morrison's shoulders sagged in defeat as the reality of his situation became clear. He would return to Boston empty-handed, his reputation damaged, his inheritance lost, and his professional standing under review. 2 weeks later, back at the ranch, Margaret went into labor during a fierce January blizzard. Dr. Harrison battled through the storm to attend to her, while Thomas held her hand and Emma waited anxiously in the kitchen with Jake and Billy. As dawn broke over the snow-covered plains, the cry of a healthy baby filled the Henderson home. Margaret looked down at her daughter, for it was indeed a girl, and saw Thomas's brown eyes looking back at her from features that would clearly favor her own coloring. "She's beautiful," Thomas whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he held his daughter for the first time. "What should we call her?" Margaret smiled through her exhaustion, thinking of all the trials that had brought them to this moment of perfect peace. "Hope, her name is Hope." Emma burst into the room moments later, her face glowing with excitement as she met her new sister. "She's so tiny. And look, she has Mama's eyes, but Papa's chin. She looks just like she belongs with us." As Margaret watched Thomas cradle baby Hope, while Emma chattered excitedly about all the things she would teach her little sister, she realized that Morrison had been wrong about one thing. She hadn't made a mistake in choosing this life. She'd found something more precious than security or comfort. She'd found a family bound together not by law or biology, but by love freely given and gratefully received. Outside, the Colorado wind still howled across the plains, but inside the Henderson home, warmth and love created their own perfect shelter against any storm life might bring. Thomas looked up from the baby in his arms to meet Margaret's eyes, and in his gaze she saw everything she'd ever hoped for: acceptance, forgiveness, and a love that had grown stronger through trial and emerged victorious over every challenge. "Welcome home, Hope Henderson," Thomas whispered to his daughter. "Welcome to your family." And Margaret knew that no matter what the future might hold, they would face it together. Thomas, Emma, baby Hope, and herself. A family forged not by deception, but by the triumph of truth and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. The mail-order bride who had come to Colorado carrying secrets and shame had found something she'd never dared dream of, a love story that was entirely her own, written not in the stars, but in the daily choices to trust, forgive, and build a life together, one honest moment at a time. In the end, Morrison had been right about one thing. The baby was indeed a gift from heaven. But not in the way any of them had expected. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.